Hey, and welcome to part 2 of Beth Harmon's Brilliancy. Now, one danger of being a chess player is that you often have a tendency to press the spacebar a lot of the time, and I had to press the spacebar on the recording, procaster here. But okay, let's get into the second part of the game. So at this point, actually, we have the position after rook takes a8, and white decided to play the move queen to c2, breaking the pin and threatening this little b5 pawn right here. Now, if I was black, I would say, the pawn is going to die anyway on move 57. So let's play a little aggressively with rook, bishop h3 and ask what he's going to do about that. Or what she is going to do about that. And then if rook c1, you can play moves like queen f6 and start to make some threats. If king f2, we can even play like Mikhail Tal, sink the knight into f4 and get a big attack going for the piece if they were to take. That's the way that I would play it, but I have the computer on, so I have a bit of an unfair advantage. And you could have an unfair advantage as well against your opponents by watching these videos time after time. Anyway, let's get into the game, where black played move bishop to c5, trying to create some tension between the bishops, hoping to get the queen more active with the recapture. But those who have been watching my videos for a long time will know by now that when you have this tension, this Mexican standoff between the pieces, well, a smart thing to do, what the master players do, is they look for a way to get the better side of the exchange. And in many cases, that's going to entail positioning ourselves so that when they take first, we are getting our piece to a better square of the recapture. The way that Beth Harmon did that here was by playing knight d1, with the idea that if Borgov were to take, you would take with the knight. And not only does that knight get to a much better square, but we see we've also cleared the way to pile of pressure on the c7 pawn. Without the bishop to defend it on d6, that pawn really does come under a lot of fire. Instead, Borgov played bishop to d6, white played knight f2, a reasonable move, although I do like the idea of bringing the knight towards the c5 square personally. Then we had knight hf4, so now this is where Borgov shows why maybe knight hf2 wasn't the strongest move, because he said, I'm sacking a piece, I'm going to throw the kitchen sink in the attack and let the chips fall where they may, to quote Tyler Durden. Well, in this position, you could take the knight, and that's probably the best move. But I can understand that Beth was a little bit nervous about getting hacked. If you play bishop to c1, the knight sinks into h4, threatening a gorgeous checkmate on the g2 square. So white plays king h1 to dodge out of the way, but after knight f3, we see that black has 2 pawns for the piece. Pretty strong attack, supported by the bishops as well. When you've got a knight in the face, it's kind of like a knife in the face, but a chess version instead. So this would lead to very sharp play. Knight a1 and rook 4 and rook a1 gets pretty unclear. Something for the computers. In any case, this I think was maybe the best try for white objectively. But white decided to be practical and say, you know what, I'll just leave that knight there, and I'm going to say you don't have an attack anyway. Now, if I was black, I would actually be a little flexible and change my plans, do a little ninja trick and say, you thought I was playing on the queen side, you thought I was playing on the king side, then you thought I was playing on the queen side, but after takes, well now I switch back, hit it go boom with f5, and suddenly that attack is looking pretty dangerous. I know I wouldn't want to be in white shoes here. But Borgov instead played queen g5. Also a reasonable attempt. We had king h1 to threaten the knight. Threaten said somewhat loosely. We had queen h5 going after the little weakness on f3. White swallows her pride and plays knight to g1. And after knight d3 we see that black does get his counterplay after all. The dream break for black in these structures is to play the move f5. Clearing the way for that bishop, clearing the way for the rook. I mean, just also weakening the white structure in general by tearing apart that beautiful pawn chain. So, in any case, the game continued with knight to c5. So the knight finally got to this beautiful outpost it's been dreaming of since move 2, but at a bit of a price. Black kept the bishop on the board with bishop c8, keeping his prized bishop pair. Because the thing with Borgov is, Borgov was in this as a very technical player. And from a very young age, you had these 2 bishops. You like to nurse them, just nurture them for the game. Like an investment, just steadily growing in value year after year. Then finally, year 30, cash him in and saying, there, I've got my bishop pair, wide open board. That's the full point in my pocket. However, this game had a bit of a different story, as we will see. Now, white could try a move like queen b3 and start to go pawn grabbing like a greedy little engine. But instead, Beth plays a move rook f1, trying to anticipate the attack. But whether you take the pawn or not, the attack's coming anyway, so you may as well grab all of the goods that you can. I mean, this is not the Titanic that is sinking here. So after rook f1, now this is where black could have played a move like f4, trying to grab some space around the king. A move like knight f8 also would be quite interesting, with the idea of going knight d7 and trying to get that knight out of your face. Instead, black played knight e7, but I'm not sure if I'm a big fan of this move because of the distance 4 concept I mentioned before. I mean, those pawns for white is completely dominating the knight. I mean, the pawns are better than the knight, it's a reverse world here. So after knight e7, white played the move of queen to d3. I think maybe it was better to try to go after it the other way, but, black has got a good position regardless. We had captures. We had to capture with the pawn. F takes e4 to make sure this pawn is nice and protected here. And now, in this position, black played the move queen g6, and it's not a bad move, but you are retreating the queen, and I think that, king h7, and maybe doing some fancy little knight maneuvers is how I would play the position. Because if you get that knight to g4, saying that queen is looking rather beautiful on this h5 square, finally it has a purpose in life. Well, we had queen g6, hiding this pawn, and we see that even though Beth played a brilliancy, that actually, and she was getting outplayed different times by Borgov, she still has some things to learn for season 2, where Girev is going to show why he will become the world champion at 16, well, until the plot spoiler comes along. But okay, jokes aside, we had king g2, king h7. You could also put the rook on the second rank, for some money in the bank, as I coach like to say it. Then we had knight f3, getting that knight off the back rank. The knight doesn't belong in the stables. That's not the place where a knight should go. This is where it belongs. So black finally came up with the idea of knight g8, but actually could have played it a bit better. Borgov had an opportunity now to play the move queen g4, sink that queen into h3, penetrating the white position, cutting through those light squares like a hot knife through butter. And now white swallows her pride and plays knight g1. Well, then you gain an extra move that you can try to use in different ways. For example, by defending your pawn and lining up some nasty little skewers with bishop c5 and bishop a6. Bishop has been lying in wait where, it's like Mr. Burns saying, "Excellent, the plan will come into motion in 20 moves, and you'll never see it coming." But okay, instead we had the move knight to g8. White played knight to h4, trying to kick around that black queen. If it were up to me, I would have played h3 and, tried to stop that queen coming in. Because after knight h4, Borgov did play queen to g4, saying, well, I'm going to check you if you're not careful. White played knight f5. I mean, just look at these knights. I mean, Kasparov used to say a knight on f5 was worth a pawn. And in fact, Kasparov was one of the main chess advisors for the Queen's Gambit. So I guess he wanted to, make sure that he got his plug in for saying, a knight on f5 is worth a pawn. Garry Kasparov trademark. But okay, let's get into the next moves. Where what black should have done here is he should have remembered what my first chess coach said of rook on the 7th rank, money in the bank. Because that is a pin after all. And it's a pretty impressive pin because suddenly this white structure is starting to fall apart. Remember that principle of 2 weaknesses from that earlier video? Because if you play a move like queen b1, for example, well, yeah, we can even start to get a little bit fancy and play a move bishop c5. Because if they take, well, we're going to have all kinds of fun stuff happening with, their pawn on e4 falling and stuff. But if you play bishop c5, then there's rook a4. And then black just tag teams on the e4 pawn, like it's an absolute bashing party, and, white's position will start to collapse from there. So that's how black should have played it. Instead, after knight f6, we get to see the genius of Beth Harmon in action and her brilliancy that had the whole crowd cheering, even her opponent cheering, like Spassky in Pawn Sacrifice. In any case, we had h3, queen to g6, and now the knight comes into the outpost with knight to e6. And this is actually a point where I want to share a little story, because this game that I'm showing you is actually based on a game between one of the most creative chess geniuses in the world, Vasily Ivanchuk, where he played all the different chess openings you could possibly imagine. He came up with all these very creative, brilliant ideas. You could say he's maybe one of the greatest players never to become world champion. And in this game, he was playing as white against Patrick Wolf in the Brilliancy 993. And Wolf was another very clever player who ultimately decided to retire from chess at a young age in order to focus on other interests. You could say somewhat like me, I also can relate to it, having retired from competitive play at a relatively young age. And actually even Ivanchuk, people say, Ivanchuk, he loves chess more than anyone else in the world. But now we see him playing checkers, he turned to the dark side. But okay, these jokes aside, white played the move knight to e6 instead of Ivanchuk's move of g4, which ultimately ended in a draw. But like I said, Beth Harmon never draws. She'd rather die than draw a chess game. Well, after knight to e6, black continued playing very well with the move rook to a4, hitting that pawn. You could also take the knight, just so you don't have the knight in your face. But as it was, now the game gets very, very sharp. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, Max, what about knight takes d6? You take and I go knight f8 and I fork the king and queen and win. But I say, remember the internet? So bishop takes e6, then after d6, cd6. Well, now it is black who has got the advantage, because suddenly this pawn is looking a bit weak. Well, in the game, instead, we had b3 played, and this is where you could say the first little mistake, or at least for a while, was played by Borgov. Now, here is where, if you're black, you can be an absolute creative genius and have, people showering your board with gold coins if you play the move of knight takes e4. And if white nabs the rook, we go knight takes g3. I mean, it looks like a crazy house game or a bug house game where white has only one move to stay in the game in order to avoid all the nasty discovered checks and all this kind of thing happening. And I have a challenge you to see if you can find it, because it's pretty tough. Well, the answer is that white has the brilliant saving move knight to e7, double exclamation mark, where if black tries to take the knight, we take, captures, and black will be down a rook. So black takes, and then we have knight f8. And it turns out that this ends up being a funny draw by perpetual check with knight fg6, because obviously taking is your suicide here. But instead, we have king h7, knight f8, and as they say in poker, the pot is split. We have a draw by perpetual check here. But as I said, Beth Harmon never draws, so therefore it was impossible for Borgov to play this move. The laws of the universe do not permit Beth to ever draw a game of chess. So we had rook takes e4 instead. We have a bit of a fight going with knight takes d6, bishop e6. Remember this combination from before. Now, hopefully here you didn't fall for the trick of knight e4 and now bishop d5. Because even though white is currently up in exchange, remember that I said about the opposite colored bishops? Opposite colored bishops favor the side with the initiative. And well, with black getting ready to get the queen coming into the king, it's clear that black is the one with the initiative. Okay, the computer says it's a draw, but like I said, Beth Harmon never draws. So we had d takes e6, e takes d6, and now white pushes that past pawn with e7. There's only one move from queening. It's so close to becoming the hero of the day, but instead, it ended up actually being the pawn within. Now, black played the move d5 because if you don't play d5, some nasty tactics are going to happen. For example, let's say you play a move like b4. Well, then we can go rook takes f6. And then we're going to even be able to play like e8 and lure that queen away. And win a rook like that. So anyway, rather than quoting more Italica references, we'll play the move d5 as Borgov did. And, well, it's a position where the computer gives 0, 0, 0. But I think you can say that it's much easier to play white based on the fact that, the passed pawn is rather annoying and black is quite tied up. In fact, the engine at a very high depth actually realizes that white is winning. So it turns out Beth understood something that even the computers nowadays don't. She was truly ahead of her time, and it wasn't because of the little trip that she took and passed. Well, in the game we had bishop c5, defending that passed pawn. Black played the move queen to e8, trying to block the pawn. Perhaps a more active defense would be to try something like h5, and we all know that, the players like Towns and Benny Watts, they was burning the midnight oil, analysing this. And they weren't really getting paid much, but, I guess being featured as a hero for Beth Harmon, well, makes you a national hero. Say, like the unsung hero, like Lombardi for Bobby Fischer. In any case, after h5, white would then play the move rook a1. And it turns out the idea of just bringing the rook in and just, taking stuff is basically going to win you the game at a very, very high depth. With h4, actually, you then go rook a6. And it gets very, very fancy, but the point is that you'll eventually bring the rook around and somehow you'll end up queening your pawn at depth 50. I mean, we're not here for the details. We're here to see Beth's brilliancy, the brilliant queen sack, rook sack, bishop sack she plays to win. Well, actually, she doesn't really play it, but you get the idea. So we had queen to f3, going for a little check with queen f5 and a little invasion. Well, then we had queen c6, b4, and around this point, even Cleo couldn't stop Beth from winning against Borgov. We had queen to e8 played, trying desperately to mount up a defense. If it were up to me, I would have tried to bring the king to the defense, because, the king is meant to be a fighting piece out on the battlefield. Only a coward stays behind the battle front lines. But okay, jokes aside, we had queen e8, queen f5, and now after king h8, white can choose her own way of winning the game, where the move that I would play is the move of queen to e6. Now, I think the reason she didn't play it is because she was a bit scared of rook e2, king g1, and then queen to g6, going for a checkmate threat. But it turns out it's white's move, and white can strike first. The way she could have done it is with queen c8. And then what do you do when your king is coming under attack? Well, one easy answer is just to trade off the queens. Queen f5. And then what we do is we go captures, promote, and black resigns. So that would be a pretty convincing way to end the game. But Beth decided, you know what, I'm going to win in style. I'm going to make sure that this game is printed in Chess Life, in all the periodicals, and that even after Borgov is long gone, they're still talking about my brilliancy with the queen sack. And so we had to move queen f6. Now, this isn't really the queen's gambit, because, the queen's gambit is an opening, not a queen sack. But you get the idea. We have takes, and at this point, Borgov realized that Beth's technique would be easily good enough after king g7, rook f8, captures, to win with the extra bishop. I mean, Beth wasn't a grandmaster for nothing. So instead, Borgov tries to go into swindle mode with the move queen h5, saying, yeah, I'm going to go and check your king all over the shop. Beth played rook f8. She wasn't bluffed. She promoted to the queen with e8 equals queen. I mean, you don't want to promote to a knight. I mean, this is not the time to show off and embarrass yourself. Well, Borgov played rook e2. White defended with the move king f1, correctly calculating that there would be no perpetual check for black. After queen h3, king e2, queen g2, white played the move rook f2, and after queen e4 and king d2, well, finally Borgov resigned here, because there's no good check, and meanwhile it's going to be open season hunting down this black king and checkmating it with all of the extra pieces that we have. So there you have it. This is Beth Harmon's Brilliancy. I'm glad you really enjoyed seeing how Beth beat the world champion in the Queen's Gambit finale. As you might have guessed, yeah, this was a big spoiler, but maybe if you haven't watched it yet, it'll give you a nice little incentive to watch the film and see, the chess actually done very accurately, and believe it or not, it might actually make you a stronger player to go and binge on Netflix. How about that? So anyway, since you enjoyed this content, I guess, when you watch all the way to the end, of course you enjoyed it, right? Well, make sure to show your appreciation with a like, leave your comments as well, and even consider subscribing for more of this stuff. All of your support does help make me make more content and to keep you guys all happy and becoming better and better chess players every day. So with that being said, well, I'm glad that you enjoyed the video. I'll have also a little opportunity in the description you can check out by clicking that link. So yeah, with that being said, I will see you in the next chess lesson, dear students, viewers, and fellow chess lovers.